Sarah Boone, the Suitcase video. This is the clearer version of the Sarah Boone case. Before the suspense begins, keep the map in mind. The people at the center were Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. The setting was Orange County, Florida, in February 2020. At first, an apartment emergency was first described through Boone's account of a night of drinking and a suitcase game. The purpose of this episode is to follow the evidence in order, not to make the case feel more mysterious than it already is. Jorge Torres Jr. was the person whose voice in final hours had to stay at the center of the case. The evidence matters because it explains what happened to real people and prevents a weak first version from taking over the story. Here is the case in plain sequence. First, Boone and Torres were together in the apartment. Second, a suitcase became part of the night. Third, Torres was inside the suitcase and could not get out. Fourth, phone videos recorded parts of what happened while he was trapped. Fifth, Boone later gave explanations to investigators. Sixth, the recordings forced those explanations to meet a fixed digital record. Seventh, the court process moved through delays, lawyers, letters, trial, verdict, and sentencing. Eighth, a jury convicted Boone of second-degree murder. Ninth, the court sentenced her to life in prison. There are three ideas to keep separate. First, this is not only a relationship story. Second, this is not only a strange accident story. Third, this is a record story, because the phone kept part of the room alive for the jury. Now the full story can move with tension, but the structure should stay clear. Watch for the first explanation, the object or record that challenged it, the point where investigators had a firmer timeline, and the legal result at the end. The first image is almost too simple to hold the weight of the case: a suitcase on an apartment floor, zipped shut, ordinary enough to belong in a closet or the back of a car. But inside that suitcase was Jorge Torres Jr., and on Sarah Boone's phone were videos that turned a private room into a courtroom record. This is not a story where the most important evidence had to be discovered years later in a forgotten file. It was already in the device Boone handed over. A phone remembers without mercy. It does not soften a voice because the morning after is frightening. It does not forget what the person holding it chose to record. In this case, the phone became the witness that could not be negotiated with. The setting was Winter Park, Florida, in February 2020. Boone and Torres had been together in an apartment. According to Boone's early account, they had been drinking, they had been playing, and the suitcase was part of a game of hide-and-seek that somehow went wrong. She said she went upstairs. She said she fell asleep. She said she woke up and found him unresponsive. That was the version that first had to survive the room. But the room was already pushing back. A dead man was inside a suitcase. The zipper was closed. The morning call to 911 could explain panic, but it could not explain the hours before the call. Investigators were not looking only at what Boone said after sunrise. They had to understand what had happened during the night, when no officer was in the apartment and no neighbor was being interviewed. That is where the phone changed everything. The videos recovered from Boone's device did not leave the jury with only a memory against a memory. They brought the night back into the room. They showed Torres inside the suitcase, pleading to be let out, saying he could not breathe, while Boone remained outside the suitcase with the phone in her hand. The prosecution did not need to make the scene feel horrifying. The evidence already did that. There is a particular dread in evidence that looks casual. A staged confession announces itself. A formal interview has rules around it. A surveillance camera at least feels like it belongs to an investigation once police arrive. But a phone video made by the person later accused in the death has a different power. It was not recorded for detectives. It was created before the case had a name. Boone's early explanation asked people to imagine an terrible accident after drinking to adults playing. A suitcase used as a prop. a woman too intoxicated or too careless to understand the danger. It is the kind of explanation that tries to turn every hard edge into confusion. The suitcase becomes a joke that went too far. The phone becomes something she barely remembered. The hours become a blur. The problem was that the video had edges. A blur does not speak in full sentences. A mistake does not keep recording while someone asks for help. A game does not answer pleas with resentment. That is why the case did not stay inside Boone's first account. The evidence forced the question away from whether something strange had happened and toward whether Boone understood what was happening while it was happening. In true crime, people often look for the hidden clue. Here, the clue was not hidden. It was stored in the same object millions of people carry all day. The phone held timing, sound, image, and attitude. It held what Boone later had to explain, not as a rumor, not as a theory, but as her own recording. The case became less about what she said she remembered and more about what the phone had preserved. The interrogation phase matters because it shows the collision between the story and the record. Detectives could ask Boone what happened. They could let her explain the drinking, the game, the sleep, the panic. Then they could return to the videos. A statement can bend. A digital record does not bend the same way. It sits there, waiting for every explanation to fit around it. That does not mean the case was legally simple. Boone's defense did not ask jurors to ignore the suitcase. It argued context. It pointed to a troubled relationship, to alleged abuse, to fear, to a history that the defense wanted the jury to consider before deciding what state of mind Boone had. The trial was not only about whether Torres died in the suitcase. That fact was not the dispute. The fight was over intent, fear, recklessness, and accountability. The relationship history made the case more complicated. But complication is not the same as excuse. A courtroom can hear about violence in a relationship and still ask what a person did in a particular moment. It can consider fear without erasing choice. It can consider trauma without pretending a trapped person had air, time, or a way out. That was the narrow, brutal path the jury had to walk. The prosecution kept pulling attention back to the physical reality. Torres was inside the suitcase. Boone was outside it. The phone was in her control. The zipper was closed. The videos showed distress. The morning came too late. In a case full of arguments about memory and relationship history, those facts kept returning with the force of a locked room. The suitcase itself became an object the audience could understand immediately. It did not require expert language. Everyone knows what a closed suitcase is for, and everyone knows what it is not for. That simplicity made the evidence harder to escape. A suitcase is designed to contain things, not people. Once a person is inside, the object stops being ordinary. It becomes the scene. The first hours after Torres was found were not just emergency hours. They were interpretation hours. Police had to decide whether they were hearing a tragic accident, a drunken mistake, a story shaped by panic, or something worse. Boone's tone, her account, and her memory gaps mattered. But the investigators also had the one thing every later version had to answer: the videos. The videos did more than show Torres in distress. They showed Boone's position relative to that distress. She was not discovering the situation for the first time in the morning. She had been present with the phone while he was inside. That distinction is why the evidence became so central. It moved the case away from a single terrible discovery and into the hours when help was still possible. The case also exposed a modern problem: people record moments they do not fully understand will become evidence. The phone is treated like a diary, a toy, a shield, a weapon, or a mirror, depending on the person holding it. In this case, the phone did not protect Boone. It trapped the night in a form that could be played in court. Before trial, the legal process became a spectacle of its own. Boone went through a long chain of lawyers. Hearings were delayed. Letters and motions drew public attention. At times the case seemed to be about the courtroom process as much as the death of Jorge Torres Jr. That attention can distort a case, because the personality of the defendant begins to overshadow the person who died. But the center of the case was never the letters. It was not the lawyer count. It was not the viral courtroom clips or the public fascination with Boone's filings. Those things made the case louder, but they did not make it more important. The important fact remained quiet and fixed. Jorge Torres Jr. was dead, and the jury had to decide what Boone's actions meant under the law. The handwritten letters still mattered in a different way. They showed how Boone tried to control the story around herself, her lawyers, her treatment, her complaints, her view of the case, her view of the court. For viewers, that created a second layer of discomfort. The same case that began with a phone video later became a paper trail of demands and explanations. The record kept growing, but the core image never moved. There was also the rejected plea offer, reported before trial, that would have allowed Boone to plead to a lesser outcome. She did not take that path. The case went to a jury. That decision changed the stakes. A plea can narrow a case into an agreement. A trial opens the room again. Evidence is presented. Witnesses testify. The defense theory is tested, and jurors are asked to bring the legal standard down onto facts that are hard to hear. When the trial began in October 2024, the courtroom had to convert years of public attention into admissible evidence. The jury was not there to decide whether the case was infamous. It was there to decide whether the state had proved second-degree murder. That distinction matters. Online viewers can react to a video instantly. Jurors have to listen to the whole case, including the defense, the instructions, and the burden of proof. The defense theory asked the jury to see Boone as someone shaped by fear and past violence, not as someone acting with a depraved mind. That is a serious claim when evidence of a volatile relationship exists. But the prosecution answered with the timeline in the videos. Fear may explain why a person sees danger. It does not automatically explain why a person records distress, leaves the person wrapped, and does not call for help until the next morning. That is why timing is the spine of the Boone case. Not just the date of the death, not just the day of the verdict, but the minutes and hours inside the apartment. How long was Torres inside? When were the videos made? What did Boone know then? What did she do after hearing him? What did she do before calling 911? Every question pushed the jury back to the same uncomfortable space, the gap between possible rescue and morning discovery. The videos were not just evidence of sound. They were evidence of opportunity. Opportunity to unzip. Opportunity to stop recording. Opportunity to call for help. Opportunity to treat the moment as an emergency instead of as a grievance. In many cases, jurors are asked to infer what a defendant knew. Here, they heard enough of the moment to judge Boone's awareness for themselves. The prosecution did not need to portray Torres as perfect to make the case. A victim does not have to be perfect to be entitled to breathe. A troubled relationship does not suspend the law. Allegations of past violence may matter deeply, and a jury can hear them. But the legal question still returns to the act at the center, a man inside his suitcase, asking for help, while the person outside did not release him. That moral clarity is one reason the case drew so much attention. It is also a reason the attention had to be handled carefully. The Suitcase video is disturbing, but it is not entertainment. If the case becomes only a clip to replay, the person at the center disappears. Jorge Torres Jr. becomes a sound from inside luggage instead of a human being whose life ended in that apartment. The courtroom brought him back into the record by name, victim impact statements, family grief, and the sentencing hearing reminded the public that the viral shape of the case was not the whole case. A family lost someone. A community watched a private death become a national headline. The law could punish, but it could not return the hours that were taken from him. On October 25, 2024, The jury found Sarah Boone guilty of second-degree murder. The speed of the verdict mattered to viewers because the trial had taken years to reach that point. But the jury's work was not a social media reaction. It was the formal answer after evidence, argument, and instructions. The video that had haunted the case since the beginning had survived the courtroom test. Then came sentencing. In December 2024, Boone was sentenced to life in prison. That sentence answered the criminal case at the trial court level, but it did not make the story feel resolved in a human sense. No sentence could make the suitcase ordinary again. No sentence could make the videos unrecorded. No sentence could give Torres back the air he was begging for. The post-sentencing record added another strange chapter. Boone continued to write. Reports described letters, complaints, and an intent to keep fighting the outcome. Appeals are part of the legal system, and a conviction can be challenged through the courts. The narration has to keep that posture straight. She was convicted and sentenced, and later filings and appellate steps do not erase that current status. For a viewer, the danger is to treat Boone's letters as the main show. They are dramatic because they reveal a voice that keeps arguing after the verdict. But the letters are downstream from the evidence. The case did not become serious because Boone wrote to the court. It became serious because because the phone showed what happened while he was still alive. The strongest true crime stories often have a single object that carries the whole case. In the Watts case, it was the camera and the oil sight. In the Boone case, it is the suitcase and the phone. One object traps the victim. The other preserves the defendant's proximity to the victim. Together, they created a record that no later explanation could fully soften. Look at how the story narrows. At first, it is an apartment emergency. Then it becomes a strange accident. Then it becomes a phone case. Then it becomes a question of state of mind. Then it becomes a trial about whether context can overcome what the videos show. Every stage gives Boone another chance to explain. Every stage brings the explanation back to the same closed zipper. That is the nightmare structure of the case. A person can be alive in one room and already trapped in the evidence of his own death. The camera is not outside the scene. It is in the hand of the person who can change the scene. The viewer knows that help is physically close. That closeness is what makes the footage feel unbearable. There is no need to invent mystery where the record already creates suspense. The suspense is not whether a suitcase can be dangerous. It is whether anyone will act in time. The suspense is in the gap between the plea from inside and the hand outside. The suspense is in the knowledge that the phone is recording when it could have been used to call for help. Boone's trial forced a jury to separate emotional complexity from legal responsibility. That is difficult because domestic violence claims are serious and because relationships can contain fear, anger, dependency, and control all at once. But the law does not ask whether a relationship was clean. It asks whether the charged act was proved. In this case, the jury said it was. The case also shows how digital evidence can change the emotional balance of a trial. Without the videos, jurors might have been left with Boone's account, forensic findings, and testimony about the relationship. With the videos, they had a recorded moment that made the state of the apartment harder to abstract. A video does not decide a case alone, but it can make denial much harder to sustain. The audio matters as much as the image. A voice from inside a confined space changes the way the room feels. It turns the suitcase from an object into an emergency. It strips away the possibility that Boone simply did not understand there was a person in danger. The sound gives the evidence a human center that still cuts through every later legal argument. That human center should remain Jorge Torres Jr., not the spectacle around Sarah Boone. His final hours are the reason the trial existed. His family's grief is the reason the sentence mattered. The phone videos are important because they preserved what he was experiencing, not because they created a viral moment for strangers to consume. Still, the public fixation is understandable. The case combines ordinary objects with extraordinary cruelty: a suitcase, a phone, a living room, a morning call, a courtroom. It does not require a hidden conspiracy or a complicated forensic puzzle. The horror is close enough to understand immediately, and that immediacy is what makes people keep watching. But immediate understanding can be dangerous. It can make viewers feel like they know everything after one clip. A full case includes the relationship history, the interviews, the motions, the defense theory, the jury instructions, and the sentence. High-impact evidence can lead the story, but it should not flatten the record. The strongest version of the story keeps both truths in view. The context was argued, and the video was devastating. When Boone said the suitcase was part of a game, the case entered a familiar territory: a defendant trying to reframe a fatal act as misjudgment. Courts hear versions of that move all the time. The difference here is that the phone gave jurors a way to test the frame. Was the night only careless? Was it confusion? Was it fear? Or did the recording show awareness and disregard that crossed the legal line? The verdict tells us how the jury answered. Second-degree murder, under Florida law, does not require the state to prove a preplanned killing in the way first-degree murder would. The question was whether Boone's actions met the standard for a depraved mind and unlawful killing. The jury decided the evidence proved that standard beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction matters for narration because exaggeration weakens a real case. The state did not need to call this a secret plot. It did not need to turn the apartment into a movie scene. It had the suitcase, the videos, the statements, the timeline, and the conduct after the fact. The real record was strong enough without adding anything. The life sentence brought the trial phase to a close, but it also left a question for anyone watching: how many chances were there for the outcome to change? One unzip, one call, one moment of recognition, one decision to treat a pleading voice as a medical emergency. The tragedy is not only that those chances existed, it is that the evidence shows they passed. The apartment timeline is what makes those chances visible. If the case were only a morning discovery, Boone could ask the world to focus on panic. But the recordings move the audience into the night before. They create a before and after inside the same apartment. Before the 911 call, there was awareness. Before the police, there was sound. Before the courtroom, there was a device already preserving the choices that later had to be explained. That is why the suitcase case does not depend on a complicated forensic twist. The most important facts line up in plain language. Torres was alive when the videos were made. Boone was outside the suitcase. He could be heard asking for help. She did not release him during the recorded moments. The next morning, he was dead. A jury can hear expert testimony and legal argument, but those basic facts form the frame every argument has to fit inside. There is also a psychological trap in Boone's accident account. It asks the listener to accept two versions of the same night at once. In one version, the suitcase was part of a careless game, strange but not malicious. In the other, Boone's own words and tone on the videos suggested anger, grievance, and control. The trial forced those two versions into the same room. They could not both carry the full weight of the evidence. The defense tried to widen the lens. That is what defenses often do when a single moment looks overwhelming. They asked jurors to see the relationship, the pattern, the fear, the drinking, the conflict, the emotional history. Widening the lens can be legitimate. It can prevent a case from being reduced to one clip. But the wider lens still has to return to the moment charged by the state. Context can explain pressure. It cannot erase the zipped suitcase. For viewers, this is where the story becomes more disturbing, not less. A clean monster narrative would be easier to process: one cruel person, one obvious act, one simple verdict. The real record is harder. It includes alcohol. It includes relationship conflict. It includes legal arguments about abuse. It includes a defendant who kept writing and complaining and trying to shape the case long after the video had already shaped it for everyone else. But the hard parts are exactly why the verdict matters. The jury was not asked to decide whether Boone was an easy person to understand. It was asked to decide whether the evidence met the law. When the verdict came back guilty, it meant the jurors had moved through the defense context and still found the central act criminal at the level charged. That is a different thing from public outrage. And it is more important. The sentencing hearing added another layer because Boone's response did not sound like a simple collapse. Reports from the hearing and aftermath described the defendant still arguing, still framing herself, still pushing back against the way the case had been judged. That posture became part of the public memory. But it should not distract from the sentence itself: life in prison for the death of Jorge Torres Jr. The court could sentence Boone, but it could not answer the private question that makes the case linger. What did she think would happen? Did she imagine the suitcase would make a point? Did she think the night would reset in the morning? Did intoxication make the danger feel distant? The legal system does not need to solve every private thought to reach a verdict, but the viewer keeps circling those questions because the evidence feels so close to rescue. The phone makes that closeness permanent. In older cases, a jury might hear that someone begged, or that someone sounded afraid, through a witness who arrived later. Here, the sound was captured at the time. That creates a different relationship between viewer and evidence. You are not hearing only about the moment. You are being forced to confront that the moment existed, and that someone chose to preserve it instead of ending it. That choice is why the video evidence became the emotional center. It was not only proof that Torres was trapped. It was proof that Boone knew he was trapped while she still had the power to change the outcome. Many criminal cases turn on what a defendant knew. This one gave the state a recording that spoke directly to knowledge, opportunity, and disregard. There is a quieter lesson here about technology. Phones do not create conscience. They only create records. A person can use a phone to call for help, to document danger, to ask someone else what to do, or to record a moment of cruelty. The device has no morality. It simply keeps the choice. In the Boone case, that kept choice became the evidence that outlasted every later explanation. So the case should be remembered with precision. Boone was not convicted because the public disliked her letters. She was not sentenced to life because the case went viral. She was convicted after a trial where the state presented evidence, the defense argued context, and the jury applied the law. The viral details may have brought people to the story, but the courtroom record is what gave the story its legal ending. That is why the Boone case feels colder the longer you sit with it. At first, the shocking part is the suitcase. Then, it is the phone video. Then it is the time between the video and the morning. Then it is the realization that the most important evidence was made before anyone else knew a crime would be alleged. The case keeps pulling the viewer backward, from verdict to recording to decision. By the end, the suitcase is no longer just an object. It is a boundary between life and abandonment. The phone is no longer just a device. It is the witness Boone created. The courtroom is no longer just a stage for viral clips. It is the place where the recorded moment was measured against the law. And the final image is the same as the first: a closed suitcase, an apartment floor, and a phone that remembered the night better than the person holding it wanted to.